Okay, nice. What a beautiful cat. It was a baby earlier today, and now it's a cat. It's something different every time.
We just swap them in and out. Nobody seems to notice.
All right, let's get our feature presentation started here. So Kevin, again from the Conservation Law Foundation, is going to talk about plastics and climate. If you have questions, I think it'll be easier to put your questions in chat during the talk, and then at the end of the talk, we can open the microphones back up. But if you have kind of clarifying questions during the talk, let's just leave those in chat. Sound good?
Yeah, that's great.
Kevin, see if you can share.
All right. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes. Cool.
Great. Well, then I will get right into it. Thank you so much, Justin, and thank you all of you for having me here tonight. You know, in these strange, unsettling times, it really is a privilege to be able to do these kinds of things, have these kinds of remote meetings. And for me, it's a privilege to be able to speak with you all and share a little bit of the plastics work that we've been doing at Conservation Law Foundation. So I really appreciate it. My name again is Kevin Budris. I'm an attorney with Conservation Law Foundation, or CLF, and I work exclusively on CLF's Zero Waste Project. And as Justin mentioned, I am going to be talking a bit about plastics pollution, and in particular, the impacts of plastics on climate and on communities at a public health level. Just a quick word about Conservation Law Foundation for those who aren't familiar with us. We are a member-supported nonprofit organization working to protect New England's environment for all people. We have offices in all the New England states except for Connecticut. Our Rhode Island office is in Providence. Our Zero Waste Project is exclusively focused on fixing our current waste crisis. We have a problem with the way we produce materials and the way we deal with waste. We have a very linear system where something's created, it moves through our lives in expedited fashion, and then it ends up in a landfill or an incinerator. Our Zero Waste Project is focused on turning that linear system into a circular system by rethinking and redesigning the way we make products and the way we deal with waste and the way we conceive of waste, and refusing wasteful produces and relying on reusable systems and refillable systems as much as possible. So today tonight in my plastics presentation, I am going to kind of do a run through the plastics life cycle, so to speak, to look at all the ways in which plastic impacts our life and our climate from before it's even made until long after we're done with it. I'm going to have a particular focus in those remarks on how it impacts our communities, particularly our frontline and environmental justice communities, and the damage that plastics are doing to our climate. I'm also going to talk a bit about some of the solutions that we have at our fingertips right now to help address the plastics crisis and its contributions to the climate crisis. So we're not going to be all gloom and doom tonight. And then I'm also going to just have a few quick words about what the plastics industry has been doing lately while we are in the throes of this pandemic. So first off, the plastics life cycle. And it's important to discuss upfront what plastics are, because for the most part, plastics are fossil fuels. 99% of the plastics that we're making in this country are derived from either fracked gas or crude oil. And the majority of that 99% here in the US is from fracked gas. And the reason that plastics are so ubiquitous in our lives and they're so cheap is because they are subsidized by the fossil fuel industry. As we're moving away from oil and gas to heat our homes and power our vehicles, the fossil fuel industry is laser focused on ramping up plastics production to make up for the lost profits on that side of their production. So up here is just a rough cut of what the plastics life cycle is. Because plastics are sourced from fossil fuels, the plastics journey starts from the extraction of those fossil fuels onto the refinement of those fuels into plastic resins. Consumption is phrased that way because so many of our products and so much of our food is wrapped in plastic when it comes into our lives, onto the waste stream, and of course, all of the plastics that end up in our environment. So starting first at extraction, and I'm going to focus on fracked gas extraction. Most of us at this point are pretty familiar with just how toxic the fracking process is. On a community level, we're talking about more than 170 toxic chemicals that can be found in fracking fluid. Those predominantly get into the drinking water of communities that live near fracking wells. And at the climate scale, fracking is hugely problematic, particularly when it comes to methane leaks from fracking wells, which are poorly tracked, and we don't really have good data on just how much methane is leaking out of fracking wells and into the atmosphere, but we know it's at a very large scale and it's having a significant impact on the climate. Those fossil fuels, once removed from the ground, are refined into plastic resins, cracked, so to speak. Refining these fossil fuels, again, has significant community level impacts, particularly when it comes to emissions of pollutants like benzene, styrene, and toluene, which are linked to cancers and neurological effects and a host of other health problems. And again, on a climate level, the refining process is hugely energy intensive and produces significant greenhouse gas emissions. And we're going to return in a bit to kind of the full scale climate impact, particularly of the production side of plastics. And then, of course, we consume plastics. And by consume, I actually mean consume and not just use, particularly when it comes to the plastic that's wrapped around our food. It's now been estimated that we're ingesting, each person is ingesting on average about a credit card's worth of plastic every week from the micro and nano plastics that our food packaging shed into our, into our food stream and into our bodies. And it's not just about these plastics ending up in our bodies, but it's also about the chemical additives that are in these plastics, because a lot of these additives are known endocrine disruptors and carcinogens. So often this phase of plastics, we only see these plastics for a very short period of time, but in that time, they can have an outsized impact on our bodies and our health. And then once those plastics spend often but a few minutes in our lives, they end up in the waste stream. And I really do mean the waste stream and not recycling. Because to this day, in the US, plastics recycling is still largely a myth propagated by the plastics industry to make us feel better about using single-use plastic bottles and other plastic products. The data that's up on this slide is with regard to #1 plastic bottles. Those are the soda bottles, the water bottles. And they're often held up as the utmost in recyclability. This is the product that Coca-Cola tells us, we can recycle this endlessly so you don't have to worry about using them. It's really a lie. Of the 3 million tons of #1 plastic bottles that were sold in the US in 2017, fewer than 6% of those bottles were recycled into new bottles. That is not meaningful recycling, it's failure. And if we look at the picture specifically here in Rhode Island, we see the same story. Every year, we're burying a little more than 62,000 tons of plastics in the Johnston landfill. At the same time, we're only processing about 8,000 tons of plastics for recycling. And of what's processed, a slim fraction of that actually is then turned into a new plastic product. Much of it is downcycled. So effectively, the plastic that moves through our life is waste. It's not turned into something else, and it's certainly not turned into the same product over again. Now, if we're not landfilling our plastic, the other alternative that's often held out is some type of high heat treatment of plastic. It means incinerating plastic or gasifying or pyrolyzing plastic. These are not alternatives. These are not real solutions to the plastic waste problem. Again, on a community level, these types of processes release a host of dangerous pollutants like dioxins, which have been called the most dangerous toxic known to humankind, furans, mercury, PCBs. These facilities belch these pollutants into nearby communities, and they're really, really dangerous. And on a climate scale, high heat treatment of plastic per unit of energy generated, because these facilities are often used to generate energy. Per unit of energy generated, they emit more carbon dioxide than coal-fired power plants. Gasifiers, pyrolyzers, incinerators are often phrased as renewable energy or waste to energy, and that just isn't the case. They're worse than coal power plants, and you really can't get much more worse than that when it comes to climate impact. And then what doesn't end up in the waste stream, unfortunately, ends up in our environment. And again, I've got some Rhode Island specific data up here on this slide, and this is from Save the Bay's International Coastal Cleanup from last year. And you can see during their one-day cleanup that they, in total, cleaned up more than 115,000 pieces of plastic from Rhode Island's shorelines. It was almost 3/4 of everything that they collected during the cleanup. And this is a one-day cleanup that covered only about 84 of Rhode Island's almost 400 miles of coastline. So this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the plastic ending up in our environment. That plastic is a hazard for wildlife, but as it breaks down into microplastics, it makes its way back into our water supply and even into the air that we breathe. And even at this stage, plastics have a significant impact on our climate. And the research on this is really just now developing, but there have been some interesting studies that have shown that degradation of plastics in our natural environment releases further greenhouse gases like methane and ethylene. And it's really a 1-2 punch, because it's not just the release of greenhouse gases when these microplastics are in our environment, but microplastics are very dangerous for plankton. And by interfering with the plankton's life cycle, plastics are interfering with the ocean's ability to absorb carbon dioxide. So they're emitting greenhouse gases, and they're interfering with our natural environment's ability to absorb those gases. Highly problematic. So just shifting gears, particularly when it comes to this full life cycle, it's important to note that the burdens of plastic pollution are not shared equally by all. Nationwide, people of color are 75% more likely to live near the petrochemical plants that are manufacturing plastics, and again, emitting pollutants like styrene and benzene and toluene. And 80% of those waste incinerators that I mentioned, the ones that are burning plastics, are located in environmental justice communities. Now, I have here an example of one such community, which some of you may have read about, Cancer Alley in Louisiana. It's home to more than 200 chemical plants. And one particular parish in Cancer Alley, St. Gabriel Parish, is home to more than 30 petrochemical plants, one parish alone, and that includes the world's largest polystyrene manufacturing facility. This parish has a 29% poverty rate and an average income that's half the national average. So our collective plastic addiction is forcing on particular communities the environmental burdens of plastics production and destruction. And then, of course, kind of looping it all back around, just to revisit some of the impacts on climate of plastics production and plastics pollution. And one of the reasons that plastics production has become such a significant driver of climate change is how much plastics production has grown worldwide. In 1950, as a planet, we only made about 2 million metric tons of plastics. By 2050, that's projected to go up to 1.8 billion metric tons per year in plastics production. And again, this is driven largely by the fossil fuel and petrochemical industries. And I'll revisit this at the end when I talk about the impacts of the COVID pandemic. But prior to the pandemic, the US fossil fuels and petrochemical industries were planning on spending more than $200 billion on factories and pipelines just in the next 5 years. It includes 12 new facilities in that Cancer Alley that I mentioned, but also $90 billion worth of facilities right here in the Northeast. And looking at just plastics production and plastics disposal, so ignoring fracked gas extraction and the degradation of plastics in our natural environment, plastics production and disposal alone are estimated to consume up to 10 to 13% of our remaining carbon budget. So to really tackle climate change, we've got to tackle our plastics addiction at the same time, which begs the question, what can we do? And luckily, we have the tools at our fingertips right now to address this plastics crisis. And fixing our recycling systems is a part of this. But recycling alone isn't going to get us out of the problem. Single-use plastic bans are big part of how we can move forward and wean off plastics. Deposit return systems, also known as the bottle bill, which unfortunately we don't have in Rhode Island, are an effective way to recycle more of our plastic bottles, but also move us towards refillable bottle systems. And an idea that's been gaining traction recently is extended producer responsibility, which can also be a big help here. So just on the single-use plastic bans, I'd say quickly that bag bans really do work. Back in 2015, Rhode Island was throwing away more than 26,000 tons of plastic bags and plastic film. That's in 1 year alone. And think how light plastic shopping bags and the plastic film that's on your groceries. Think how light those things are. This is a huge volume of plastic that we're throwing in the landfill every year. But towns like Barrington stepped up, and Barrington was followed by a number of other towns and cities in Rhode Island. And we actually now have plastic bag bans that cover more than half of Rhode Island's population. And we had good traction on a bag ban in the Rhode Island State House this past legislative session before, the world got thrown off its axis. But we're hoping to kind of continue that work. And in the meantime, local communities are going to continue doing a lot of this work to pass single-use plastic bans. And we can go beyond bags. Polystyrene food containers, straws, stirrers, balloons. These are all individual types of single-use plastics that communities throughout New England have stepped up and banned. And in fact, several towns in Massachusetts have gone so far to ban single-use plastic beverage bottles, which is a great next step. I mean, there are solutions for all of our products where we don't have to rely on these single-use plastics. And again, a good way to get us towards those refillable systems are bottle bills, which in the meantime help us more effectively recycle our plastic bottles. Michigan and Oregon have bottle bills with 10-cent deposits. You have to put a 10-cent deposit on a container when you buy a beverage. You get those 10 cents back when you return it, when you redeem it. Michigan and Oregon have 90% redemption rates. Compare that to Rhode Island, where we're only collecting about 39% of our containers for recycling. So we can do much better on recycling in the meantime by passing bottle bill legislation. And as I mentioned, bottle bills help us transition to refillable systems. Quebec and Oregon have used their existing bottle bill infrastructure to pivot towards refillable beer bottle systems. And under these systems, they work much like the normal recycling bottle bill. You put a deposit on a beer bottle when you get it. After you drink the beer, you bring the bottle back, and instead of being crushed and recycled, it's cleaned and refilled. It's much easier, much less energy intensive process. And the last solution that I'm just going to touch on, again, is called Extended Producer Responsibility, or EPR for packaging. And this innovative solution seeks to shift the costs of recycling and waste management off of towns, cities, and residents and back on to the producers who are manufacturing and pumping out all of this plastic packaging. And what this does is it incentivizes easier to recycle packaging, particularly plastic packaging, but also importantly, reusable packaging to get away from all of the plastic wrap and all of the plastic clamshells that all of our stuff comes in. And as I said at the beginning, I just want to touch on what's going on with plastics during this pandemic, because the plastics industry has spread a lot of misinformation in this current world in which we live. They've pushed for communities to abandon reusable bags, and they've pushed for delays and rollbacks of plastic bag bans, all under the auspices of consumer safety, that somehow reusable bags are dangerous. And they've even gone so far, and I have a quote up here on this slide, the plastics industry has gone so far to request from the Health and Human Services a statement that single-use plastics have certain health and safety benefits, which, as we've mentioned, as I just discussed, really isn't the case. And we've seen these rollbacks throughout New England on a local level in Rhode Island and on state levels elsewhere. And it's important to note that what they're spreading just isn't true. The studies that they rely on are deeply flawed and industry funded. There's no evidence that somehow viruses like coronavirus live longer on reusable packaging than they do on plastic packaging. And it's understandable why they're doing this, because it's been exposed during this pandemic that the plastics industry might be in trouble. Again, they've invested $200 billion in expanding these facilities. If plastics demand doesn't continue to rise, the plastics industry is actually going to be in some serious hot water. And this is evidence that the legislation that we've been working on and that states throughout the country have been passing is successful. By banning single-use products, by improving recycling, by moving to bottle bill systems, we can reduce the demand of plastics, hopefully put some of big plastics out of business, and all in one fell swoop start to attack a significant chunk of our climate crisis. So if we continue to pursue these measures, I think that we can kind of see success in the path ahead. And with that, I'd love to jump to any questions that you all might have.
So there were a couple of comments people put in. Somebody had mentioned fracking in West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania is horrifying. And another person was wondering if the slides that you displayed are available to view at any time.
Yeah, I would be happy to. I suppose I can. Maybe I'll send them to you, Justin, and you could distribute them to everyone that was.
Yeah.
Does that work?
I'd be glad to.
Yeah. Just to say that my contact information is there on the first slide, so everyone should feel free to reach out to me with any conversations, any questions, because I'm happy to answer anything offline as well.
Yeah, at this stage, folks, you can feel free to unmute and ask a question out loud. Melissa?
Are there still BPAs and receipts?
At least in some receipts. You know, receipts are really a black box, because some receipts have a different makeup than others, but BPA is still in receipts, as are a number of other toxic chemicals. Receipts are pretty nasty. I try to touch them as little as possible.
And they don't go in recycling.
Yeah, and they do not go in recycling.
Your law firm, what kinds of cases does it handle in terms of these plastics? Are there people who become ill and then you fight for compensation, or?
So we're not a law firm. We are a nonprofit organization, and we do bring cases, but not on behalf of individual clients. So we don't represent folks who have, who've been injured by the waste industry or plastics industry or any other polluting industry. But we do bring cases occasionally on behalf of our members against polluting facilities to get them to stop or to remediate, so on and so forth. We are focused here in New England. So when it comes to plastics production, thankfully, we don't see a lot of that here in New England. But we do see a lot of plastics disposal and incineration in New England, and it's problematic.
Thank you.
Yep.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Abby.
Oh, I'm trying to think what we can do to put some of these ideas into action. And I was thinking about the refillables. Do you know of any, do any refillable companies come to mind in the area that we should be helping support?
So at present, in terms of refillable companies, like companies rolling out kind of wide-scale refillable solutions, there aren't any that I'm aware of that kind of have large-scale operations in Rhode Island. We actually are hoping possibly in the near-term future to work with some groups in a few states in New England and in a few select cities that will be working on kind of a wide-scale refillable solution, and the types of solutions where rather than bringing your own container, which is awesome, and I do it, a lot of people do it, it's a really effective way to cut down on waste, having refillable solutions that you're only putting a deposit on and returning, like universal cups and universal takeout ware, so that you eat or you drink and you put it in a return bin, and it gets cleaned and it gets sent back out to a wide variety of restaurants. Those are the kind of wide-scale solutions that could really kind of take the impact to the next level. Because encouraging folks to use reusables is great, but we kind of need a next phase of impact when it comes to reusable solutions.
I guess the way I was picturing it was, it being a company-specific thing, kind of like you mentioned the beer bottles. I know in Germany that's how the beer bottles work. But I guess, and I've seen some ads on Facebook for refillable companies, like get your ice cream in a refillable and send it back.
Oh yeah, yeah. They're good. I mean, there are companies, here in Providence where you bring your own container and can fill things like soap and shampoo and body lotion, but there are also some online options for that type of stuff as well, where they send you a product in a container, you return the container, they refill it, which is just it makes a lot of sense, and it's really easy to manage once companies are doing that type of thing.
I have a question that involves the economics of it. There's an immense amount of money invested in producing oil. For a long time, people have thought that using oil or petroleum as a energy source rather than a hydrogen economy is really foolish, that it should be used as a raw material. With that huge investment, the urge to make plastics is pretty strong. Are there alternative things that can be done with the oil or the hydrocarbons besides making plastics you could divert this industry towards?
That's a great question, and I do not have the answer to that.
One idea might be like non-single use, like non-disposable plastics, but high-tech
I
plastic.
think of turning it into food, turning it into medicines, turning it into other things besides plastic.
Yeah. And to Justin's point, durable plastics are a certainly better option than single-use plastics. They still come with a host of problems, but single-use plastics are dominating this predicament, so to speak. In my slides, I mentioned that we were burying about 62,000 tons of plastic every year in Rhode Island. About 44,000 of those tons are single-use plastics. So it's the single-use plastics that are driving a lot of the problem here. When it comes to solutions, obviously relying on fossil fuels for as few of our products as possible would be the most ideal. In terms of alternatives for the fossil fuels that have already been taken out of the ground, I don't have the best grounding in chemistry, so to speak. I went to law school because I wasn't great at chemistry. So,
And I was a chemistry teacher. One question would be, any use of plastics is not good. I was thinking of the gyre in the North Pacific, where the mass of plastics is 6 times the living mass. And that's really a terrible number.
yeah.
And that's only going to get worse. So diverting the use of the hydrocarbons and all of that investment in producing them into something besides plastic is a way to push away from increasing the mass of plastic, not only in the water, but in the land also.
Mm-hmm.
Because that plastic is winding up in us.
It sure is.
Maybe one more question, and then we'll try to give Kevin some big virtual applause. Any parting words of wisdom? Or I guess I wanted to ask, oh, sorry.
I have a question, Kevin.
Yeah.
Earlier in the year, I was at the State House testifying when the Act on Climate 2020 bill was being introduced.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a woman representative who was introducing the bottle bill.
Yes.
And she was proposing a 10-cent return. But before she even finished her introduction, she was offering to cut it to 5 cents. Do you know, that bill was introduced, but has it gone anywhere?
So that was Representative Carol Hagan McEntee. She introduced the bottle bill legislation in the House. Senator Mark McKinney introduced comparable legislation in the Senate. Neither of them had an opportunity to make any real progress before the pandemic, and the legislature has obviously shifted entirely to other priorities, which is understandable. So there was testimony heard on that bill that night after the climate bill hearing. And we were hoping to have a Senate hearing sometime, and it's probably just not going to go anywhere this year because of the state of affairs. But hoping that we're in a better place come next winter, I expect there to be another push on the bottle bill. And I certainly would like to see it have a 10-cent deposit because that's where states are moving, and 5 cents just isn't the economic incentive that it used to be. And states with 5-cent deposits are seeing significantly lagging return rates on bottles.
Sounds like we should tell Representative McEntee that we want a 20-cent deposit.
I was going to say it should be 50 cents because in Germany it's like 30, 35 cents, and some people don't even bring those cans in.
Yeah. There are places that have legislation. Oregon is one of them. That it's basically there's an escalator clause in the legislation that if your return rate doesn't hit X, then the deposit level is automatically increased.
Oh,
that
smart.
type of escalator clause is a great approach to bottle bills, and it's something I'd certainly like to see in legislation.
All right, I'm going to press this button marked unmute all. And if that worked, you might need to accept a pop-up window on your screen to unmute. Or if that worked, then everybody can clap for Kevin, because that was truly a fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for listening. I'll get the slides to Justin so you can all see it. Hit me up with any questions, and love to continue this conversation with any that would like to.
That was awesome.